In 1843, a judge in South Carolina codified a nightmare into law, reaffirming the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum. This legal Latin meant that which is born follows the womb. It was a clean, bureaucratic phrase that accomplished a monstrous task. It legally erased the paternity of any master who fathered a child with an enslaved woman. The child was not a son or a daughter. It was, by law, simply more property belonging to the owner of the mother. This law was a scalpel designed to sever inconvenient family ties and protect the pure bloodlines of the aristocracy. But the law could not erase biology. It could not stop blood from recognizing itself, often only after it was far, far too late. Cinematic cue, the faint, rhythmic echo of a distant church bell, tolling slowly, overlaid with the sound of a dry whisper. This system of willed ignorance created secrets that festered in the humid air of the Lowcountry, birthing horrors that no ledger book could ever contain. Tonight, we unseal a story that was deliberately buried, a story of a transaction so vile it threatened to shatter the very family it was meant to preserve. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Elias Thorne believed he was the master of his world. At 28, he was the sole heir to Cypress Hollow, a sprawling, isolated rice plantation on a remote sea island off the South Carolina coast. The air here was different from the mainland, thick and heavy, tasting of salt, pluff mud, and the sweet, cloying decay of the marsh. The live oaks, draped in curtains of Spanish moss, looked like grieving giants, their branches filtering the sunlight into a weak, cathedral-like gloom. Elias had returned 2 years prior from Boston, his mind filled with Northern philosophy and a disdain for what he considered the crude, provincial sensibilities of his peers. Yet, he had seamlessly slipped into the role of master. He wore the power of his station like a well-tailored coat, managing the ledgers, the harvests, and the human inventory with a cold, detached efficiency. He told himself he was a more enlightened owner, that he provided adequate food and avoided the gratuitous cruelty his father had favored. But this was a lie he used to palliate his own conscience. He was a king in a kingdom of misery, and the isolation of Cypress Hollow only amplified his authority. The nearest town was a half-day's boat ride away, and the bell in his study was the only law that mattered. The plantation was haunted, though not by spirits. It was haunted by the memory of Augustus Thorne, Elias' father. Augustus had been a man of terrifying appetites, for land, for money, and for women. He had built Cypress Hollow from a struggling indigo farm into a rice empire, a feat accomplished through ruthless acumen and a cruelty that was spoken of only in whispers. He had died 5 years ago, collapsing from an apoplectic fit during a dinner party, his face turning the color of a ripe plum before he crashed into a sideboard of heirloom china. Elias had felt not grief, but relief. Yet his father's presence was everywhere. It was in the foundation of the grand house, in the design of the oppressive slave quarters, and in the labyrinthine canals that fed the rice fields, dug by hand by men and women Augustus had worked to death. Elias loathed his father's crude displays of power, yet he found himself unconsciously emulating the man's posture, his way of speaking, his assumption of absolute dominion. He was trapped by the inheritance, forced to perpetuate a system he claimed to despise because he was too weak and too comfortable to dismantle it. The plantation was a machine built on his father's sins, and Elias was now its willing operator. The only other white face at Cypress Hollow belonged to Beatrice Thorne, Elias' mother. Beatrice was a woman carved from ice, rigid with a piety that masked a deep, simmering bitterness. She had been a Charleston belle, married off to Augustus to secure a union between two powerful families. She had endured her husband's infidelities, his rages, and his casual brutality by retreating into a fortress of domestic order. She managed the main house with a tyrannical precision, obsessed with the purity of her bloodline and the preservation of the Thorne name. She saw the enslaved people not as humans, but as potential vectors of chaos, contaminants in her orderly world. She had watched her husband's appetites with a cold, reptilian eye, knowing he had sullied himself, and she channeled that decades-old resentment into a venomous disdain for any woman she deemed low. Her relationship with Elias was formal, strained. He was her heir, the vessel of her legacy, and she scrutinized his every action, terrified he would repeat the moral failures of his father and endanger the fragile illusion of aristocratic purity she had spent her life maintaining. In the humid, fever-choked summer of 1851, Elias' carefully managed world was disrupted. A letter arrived from his overseer, a man named Hatcher, informing him that the head housemaid, a woman named Prudence, had succumbed to yellow fever. The news was an inconvenience. Prudence had been trained by Beatrice for 20 years. She was efficient, silent, and knew the house's rhythms. Now she was gone, and the gap she left was a disruption to Beatrice's rigid order. "You must go to Charleston," Beatrice informed Elias over their silent, tense dinner. "The house cannot function without a proper maid. We need someone clean." Elias balked at the suggestion. He detested the vulgarity of the Charleston slave market. He found the spectacle of human auction to be base and ungentlemanly, a stark reminder of the brutal mechanics beneath his philosophical pretensions. He preferred his property to be inherited, anonymous, already broken by the system. But his mother was insistent. The fever season had been bad, the household was short-staffed, and she would not tolerate imperfection. Reluctantly, Elias agreed. He would take the sloop to the city, conduct the business, and return as quickly as possible, hopping to wash the stench of the market from his hands. The Great Slave Mart on Chalmers Street was a vision of hell. It was an enclosed building, a deliberate move by the city to hide the trade from the delicate eyes of ladies walking past. But the facade of civility did nothing to mask the reality. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and a terror so profound it was almost tangible, like a low-frequency hum vibrating in the floorboards. Cinematic cue. The chaotic sound of an auctioneer's patter, muffled, competing with the sound of a fly buzzing near a microphone. Elias stood near the back, his silk handkerchief pressed to his nose, his stomach turning. He felt a wave of self-loathing, not for the system, but for his proximity to its ugliest gears. He watched as men, women, and children were paraded onto the block, their bodies poked, prodded, their teeth inspected like livestock. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and sweat stains darkening his waistcoat, rattled off their qualities with cheerful indifference. Elias intended to buy the first healthy-looking woman suitable for housework and leave immediately. Then the auctioneer presented Lot 14. "And now, gentlemen, a rare jewel from New Orleans. A fancy girl, this one. 18 years of age, light-skinned, literate, and trained in the fine arts of domestic service. Answering to the name Alara." A woman was led onto the stage. She was not like the others, where they were hollowed by despair or shaking with fear. This woman was preternaturally still. She was dressed in a simple, clean cotton dress, but she held herself with the posture of a duchess. Her skin was the color of pale amber, and her eyes were the strangest color, a deep hazel gray, and they were utterly vacant, fixed on a point on the far wall, refusing to meet the gaze of the buyers. She did not plead, she did not cry. She simply endured, her stillness a form of armor. She was beautiful, but it was a haunting, unnerving beauty. The auctioneer mentioned she was an orphan, the property of a recently deceased New Orleans merchant, her parentage unknown but clearly of quality. She was, in the vile parle sense of the day, a quadroon, sold to settle her previous owner's gambling debts. Elias Thorne forgot his intention to leave quickly. He was mesmerized. He did not see a person, he saw an object. He saw a piece of art, something exotic and beautiful that would look perfect in his home, a testament to his taste and wealth. He saw her literacy not as a threat but as an amusement. Here was something refined that he could own, a beautiful, intelligent doll. When the bidding started, it was brisk. Men who ran high-class brothels in the city and other wealthy planters looking for a companion for their studies drove the price up. But Elias, in a fit of arrogant impulse, was determined to have her. It became a duel between him and a corpulent man smelling of brandy. The price climbed to a staggering sum, more than one would pay for a skilled blacksmith. Elias made the final bid, his voice cutting through the humid air with cold finality. The gavel fell. Sold to Mr. Elias Thorne of Cypress Hollow. He felt a dark, possessive thrill. He had not just bought a servant, he had acquired a masterpiece. He had outbid them all. He left the market immediately, arranging for her to be delivered to his sloop, never once having looked her in the eye. The journey back to Cypress Hollow was conducted in near-total silence. Alara sat at the stern of the small sloop, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the churning, muddy water. Elias tried to engage her, pointing out landmarks with a proprietary air. "That is Fort Sumter. This is the start of the Sea Islands." He spoke to her as one might speak to a new, frightened horse, his voice laced with a condescending gentleness that was more insulting than a command. Alara responded with single, whispered words. "Yes, sir." "No, sir." She refused to give him more. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap, her only possession, and her knuckles were white where she gripped it. Elias found her silence intriguing, a puzzle to be solved. He saw it as modesty, perhaps even intelligence, rather than what it was, a profound, calcified shell of trauma. As the sloop navigated the winding, claustrophobic waterways of the salt marsh, the world seemed to shrink. The air grew heavier, the cypress trees closing in, and the isolation of the plantation became absolute. Alara looked at the moss-draped trees, and for the first time, her stillness broke. Elias saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek, which she wiped away with a quick, angry gesture. Alara's arrival at the main house was a disturbance, like a stone dropped into a still, murky pond. The other house servants, Mamie, the elderly cook, and Thomas, the butler who had served the Thornes for 40 years, observed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They had seen fancy girls brought in by the old master, Augustus. They knew this was not a simple replacement for Prudence. They saw the way Elias looked at her, the way he spoke to her. They saw a curse. Mamie, in particular, watched Alara with a sad, knowing gaze. She saw the girl's fine hands, unused to hard labor, and the terror she was trying so desperately to hide behind a mask of compliance. When Elias instructed that Alara be given a private room in the attic, rather than a space in the communal quarters, the hierarchy of the house was shattered. This girl was not a servant. She was a new, dangerous variable, and the other slaves knew to keep their distance, lest their master's volatile interests splash onto them. Alara was utterly alone, an exotic prisoner in a house that hummed with resentment and unspoken history. Beatrice Thorne's reaction was immediate and visceral. When Elias presented Alara to her in the main parlor, Beatrice's china teacup rattled in its saucer. She stared at the girl, her face tightening into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. It was an irrational, disproportionate hatred. Alara was polite, her voice soft, her curtsy perfect. But Beatrice saw something else. She saw a phantom. There was something in the girl's face. The precise shape of her chin, the high arch of her cheekbones, the unnerving hazel-gray eyes that felt like a personal affront, a sickening echo of a past Beatrice had tried to bury. She saw her late husband, Augustus, in the girl's features. It was impossible, of course. A fleeting, absurd resemblance. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, a symptom of her own paranoia. She told herself she was disgusted by Elias' obvious, vulgar attraction to the girl, a repeat of his father's base instincts. "She will not do," Beatrice said, her voice like chipping ice. "I wanted a servant, Elias, not this. She smells of New Orleans." But Elias, for the first time, overruled his mother. "She is literate. She will work in the library. She will be my personal attendant. You will not countermand me, mother." Beatrice was forced to acquiesce, but a seed of cold, obsessive suspicion had been planted. Alara was assigned to the library, a large, dusty room filled with books Elias had shipped from Boston and his father had never read. Her duties were light, dusting the spines, organizing the shelves, and keeping the fire lit. But the job was a pretense. Elias used the library as his stage. He would discover her there, spending hours in the room while she worked, her presence a silent audience to his performance of intellectualism. He would read aloud from Byron and Shelley, his voice resonating in the quiet room, and then ask for her thoughts. It was a grotesque parody of courtship, a cruel game of power. He was not interested in her mind. He was interested in the novelty of her having one. Alara, trapped, learned to play the game. She gave him shallow, intelligent-sounding answers, just enough to satisfy his ego but never enough to reveal her true self. She learned that her survival depended on her ability to be a mirror, reflecting back the image of the enlightened master he so desperately wanted to see. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every rustle of her dress, every time she reached for a book, he watched her. The air crackled with his unspoken, absolute authority. Elias became obsessed. He saw her not as his sister, not even as a woman, but as a territory to be conquered. Her quiet, dignified resistance fueled his desire. He began to isolate her further. He forbade her from taking her meals with the other servants, insisting she eat in the library after he and his mother had finished dinner. He was protecting her, he told himself, from the coarseness of the other slaves. In reality, he was severing her last potential ties to any community, making her world shrink until it contained only him. He would ask her about her life in New Orleans, probing for details. "Who was your mother? Who was your father?" Alara's answers were always the same. "My mother was named Adeline, sir. She was a seamstress. She died of consumption. I never knew my father." This, Elias discovered, was the truth as she knew it. She was a bastard, an orphan, a piece of driftwood washed up from the chaotic world of New Orleans, and now she belonged to him entirely. This total ownership, this lack of any past or family to protect her, was to him the most seductive quality of all. He could invent her, define her, and use her as he saw fit. The house bell was her tormentor, cinematic cue, the sharp, jarring clang of a brass handbell. It was a small, silver bell Elias kept on his desk, its ring clear and cold. When he rang it, she was to come. It rang for trivial things, more wine, a mended shirt, a book from a high shelf. But its true purpose was to reinforce her tether. One night, long after the rest of the house was asleep, the bell rang. Not from the library, but from his private study at the far end of the hall. The sound cut through the oppressive low-country night, through the din of the cicadas and tree frogs. Alara's blood went cold. She knew what this summons meant. Mamie had warned her, her eyes full of pity. "He his father's son, child. Ain't no escapin' that." She walked down the long, dark corridor, the floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and the faint, metallic tang of the marsh. She stopped outside his door, her hand trembling, clutching the small, carved wooden songbird she kept in her pocket, the last object her mother had given her. She entered the study. Elias was sitting at his desk, a decanter of brandy half-empty beside him. The room was lit only by a dying fire, casting long, monstrous shadows on the walls. Cinematic cue, the sound of a log collapsing in a fireplace, a hiss of embers. He did not look at her. He stared into the flames. "It is lonely here, Alara," he said, his voice quiet, almost melancholy. "This house, this island, it eats a man alive." She said nothing. She simply stood by the door, a statue of terror. He turned, and his eyes were not the eyes of the enlightened philosopher from the library. They were the eyes of his father, Augustus, predatory, empty, and certain. He stood up. "Your mother," he said, walking toward her. "She taught you to be obedient, didn't she?" It was not a question. Alara shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. The description of the act itself would be buried in silence, as the act itself was. The historical record omits the reality of such moments, focusing only on the legalities. But the room was filled with the evidence of it. The smell of brandy on his breath, the scratching sound of her cotton dress against the harsh wool of the carpet, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, methodically measuring out the moments of her violation. It was a cold, silent, and absolute expression of power, an act of ownership that reduced her from a rare jewel to a mere thing. In the days and weeks that followed, Alara became a ghost. She performed her duties in the library with a new, terrifying efficiency. Her mind had retreated to a place no one could reach. She was a perfect automaton, dusting books, serving wine, her face a smooth, impenetrable mask. The only sign of her trauma was the way she incessantly, unconsciously rubbed the small wooden songbird in her apron pocket. She had rubbed the carved feathers so smooth that the wood was slick and polished, worn down by her grief. She would spend what few hours she had alone in her attic room, not crying but staring at the slanted ceiling, listening to the rain on the shingles. The sound of the bell now caused a visible flinch, a slight tremor in her hands that she would quickly hide. She was trapped completely. The marsh, the water, the isolation of Cypress Hollow. It was a prison without bars, and Elia's Thorne was its sole warden. Her silence, which he had once found intriguing, now satisfied him in a different way. It was the silence of submission, the silence of a broken thing. Elia's, for his part, was suffused with a dark, proprietary pride. Having possessed her, he now felt a twisted sense of responsibility, the kind a man might feel for a prized mare. He rewarded her. He had a new dress made for her by a seamstress in Charleston, a deep, shocking crimson, the color of fresh blood. When she was forced to wear it, the other servants averted their eyes. The dress was a brand, a public declaration of her status. He would bring her gifts from his study, a leather-bound book of poetry, a sweet orange smuggled from the docks. These small kindnesses were, in their own way, more violent than the act itself. They were a demand for a gratitude she could not feel. He was writing a narrative in his own mind, that he was a benevolent master and she was a willing, cherished concubine. He needed this narrative to live with himself, to maintain the fiction of his enlightenment. Alara accepted the gifts with a whispered "Thank you, sir," her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on the floor. Each gift was another layer of suffocating obligation, another chain. 2 months passed. The suffocating heat of deep summer gave way to the milder, damp air of autumn, and with the change in seasons, Alara felt a new, terrifying change within her own body. It began as a sickness in the mornings, a wave of nausea that sent her retching into the shrubbery behind the kitchens. At first, she dismissed it as a symptom of the bad water or the sheer, unrelenting stress of her existence. But the sickness did not pass. It settled in. Her monthly courses, which had always been regular, stopped. She felt a strange, heavy fullness, a biological betrayal. The realization came to her not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping, icy dread. She was pregnant. The act in the study, the moment of her deepest violation, had planted a seed. She was now carrying the child of her master, a child who, according to the laws of South Carolina, would be born a slave, a child who would be the property of the man who had assaulted her. The despair was absolute, a darkness so complete she could barely breathe. Mamie the cook was the first to know. She saw the sickness, the subtle changes in Alara's body, the new, haunted look in her eyes. Mamie had been born at Cypress Hollow. She had seen 3 generations of Thorne men and the trail of outside children they left behind. One afternoon, finding Alara weeping silently in the pantry, Mamie pressed a bundle of dried herbs into her hand. "This is cotton root," she whispered, her voice rough but not unkind. "You make a tea. You drink it strong. It will bring things back. He don't never need to know, child." Alara looked at the herbs, the key to her potential freedom, and then at Mamie. She clutched the bundle, but she could not bring herself to use it. Was it fear of the pain, fear of being caught, or was it something deeper, more complex? A twisted, biological refusal to destroy the only thing in the world that was a part of her, even if it was also a part of him. She did not take the tea. She hid the herbs in her attic room, and in her inaction her fate, and the child's, was sealed. The pregnancy soon became impossible to hide. Her sickness grew worse. One morning, while serving Elias and his mother their breakfast, a wave of vertigo washed over her. The silver tray clattered to the floor and Alara collapsed, fainting onto the expensive Persian rug. Beatrice Thorne was on her feet instantly, her face a mask of disgust. Elias rushed to Alara's side, lifting her, his expression one of annoyance rather than concern. It was Beatrice, however, who saw the truth. Her eyes narrowed, taking in the subtle swell of Alara's abdomen, the faint pallor of her skin. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She knew the signs. She knew her son's appetites. This girl, this thing he had brought into her house, was carrying his child. She looked from Alara's unconscious form to her son, who was awkwardly holding her, and her eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. This was not just a moral failing, it was a contamination of her home, her sanctuary. "Get her out of my sight," Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking. Elias, flustered, carried Alara to her room, leaving his mother alone in the dining room, trembling with rage. When he returned, she confronted him. "She is with child, your child." It was an accusation, not a question. Elias, recovering his composure, straightened his waistcoat. He was not ashamed. He was, to his own surprise, almost pleased. He saw it as a sign of his own virility, a natural consequence of ownership. "It would seem so," he said, his voice casual. "She is a healthy girl. The child will be strong. It will be a valuable addition to the property." This cold financial assessment of his own offspring, this reduction of his blood to stock, was the final horrifying proof for Beatrice. He was not just his father's son, he was worse. He was Augustus, but with a cold, philosophical detachment that was somehow more profane than his father's simple, brutish lust. "You will sell her," Beatrice commanded. "At once." "I will not," Elias replied, his voice flat. "She is mine. The child is mine. They will remain at Cypress Hollow." Beatrice's rage was not just about the social taboo or the bastard child. It was about the resemblance. The gnawing, obsessive feeling that Alara's face was a mockery of her own history. Now that the girl was pregnant, the resemblance seemed to sharpen. Beatrice began to watch her with a forensic, terrifying intensity. She would appear silently in the library, staring at Alara while the girl dusted, her eyes tracing the line of Alara's jaw, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her hands. She was searching for the piece of the puzzle that would explain this profound, sickening sense of déjà vu. She saw Augustus everywhere in the girl's face. It was a torment. She convinced herself she was going mad, that the humidity and the isolation were making her see phantoms. But the feeling would not abate. It grew stronger every day, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this girl was connected to her past in a way that was too horrible to name. The pregnancy was difficult. Alara was often sick, confined to her attic room for days at a time. The fever that had taken Prudence still lingered in the house, and Alara contracted a mild, lingering case. She became weak, delirious. In her fever dreams, she would cry out not for Elias but for her mother. Mamie, tending to her with a reluctant pity, would bathe her forehead with cool water. During one of these fever bouts, Alara clutched the small, wooden songbird to her chest. She moaned, her voice hoarse. "Adeline, Adeline," he promised. He promised he would come for us. Her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the object. It was not just a carving. Mamie saw that a small piece of the bird's tail twisted off. It was a locket, a tiny, intricately carved wooden box. Inside there was nothing but a single, tightly curled lock of dark, auburn hair, tied with a thread and a minuscule, tarnished silver sigil, the letter T. Beatrice, unable to stay away, had entered the room in time to see the locket. She stood in the doorway, frozen. She had not come to help, she had come to look at the girl, to feed her own obsessive suspicion. She saw the wooden bird, she saw the lock of hair, and she saw the tiny, tarnished silver T. Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the carving. She recognized the sigil. It was the mark of a specific artisan in Charleston, a man her husband, Augustus, had used exclusively for his private commissions. And the bird, she remembered the bird. Augustus had spent a month in his workshop carving it 20 years ago. He had told her it was a folly, a gift for a business associate's child. He had taken it with him on one of his long business trips to New Orleans, and he had come back without it. She looked at the delirious girl in the bed, clutching the object, and the disparate, horrifying pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. Adeline, the bird, the New Orleans connection, the face. Beatrice stumbled from the room, her hand pressed to her mouth, a silent scream building in her chest. She did not go to her own chambers. She went, for the first time in 5 years, to her late husband's study. The room was a mausoleum, left exactly as it was the day he died. The air was stale, smelling of old tobacco, leather, and decay. She walked to his massive mahogany desk, the one Elias now used for his own performances in the library, but this was the original, the seat of Augustus's power. She knew, as all wives of unfaithful men know, where the secrets were kept. She produced a small iron key from her own chatelaine, a key she had not touched since his death. She unlocked a false-fronted drawer hidden beneath the main ledger shelf. It was a drawer she had never had the courage to open while he was alive. She opened it now. Inside, it was not the plantation ledgers. It was his private life, meticulously documented. There was a miniature portrait painted on ivory of a stunningly beautiful Creole woman. She had high cheekbones, a proud chin, and haunting hazel-gray eyes, Alara's eyes. On the back, in Augustus's sprawling, arrogant hand, was written, "My Adeline, New Orleans, 1833." Beatrice let the portrait fall as if it had burned her. Beneath it was a stack of letters, tied with a faded velvet ribbon. They were from Adeline. They were love letters full of a passion and tenderness Augustus had never once shown Beatrice. She read them, her hands shaking, her world dissolving. The letters chronicled their affair, his visits, his promises, and then the birth of a child. "I have named her Alara," Adeline wrote. "She is your living image, my love. She has your eyes and your chin. She is a true daughter of the tea." Beatrice sank to the floor, the letters scattering around her. She found another one, dated nearly a decade later. Adeline's script was weaker, shakier. "The consumption is taking me, Augustus. I fear for our daughter. You must come for her. You are her father, her only protection. The creditors will not be kind. She loves the songbird you carved for her. She keeps it as her only treasure." And then a final, damning piece of paper, a bill of sale. Not for a slave, but from a midwife, for the birth of a daughter, Alara, to Adeline Rousseau in New Orleans. The date was exactly 19 years ago. Elias was 9 years old at the time. The timelines, the locations, the names, they all aligned. Alara was not just some random, fancy girl from the market. She was Augustus Thorne's daughter. She was Elias' half-sister. The full, unmitigated horror of the truth settled over Beatrice. Her son, Elias, in his arrogant, impulsive desire to own something beautiful, had gone to Charleston and bought his own sister. And then, Beatrice's mind recoiled from the next thought, the image of Alara's collapsed form, the unmistakable swell of her stomach. The child Alara was carrying. It was the product of her son and her husband's daughter. It was an abomination. It was a tangle of blood so profound it defied sanity. Her hatred for Alara vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. This was not the girl's fault. This was the final, monstrous sin of Augustus Thorne, reaching out from his grave to destroy them all. Her obsession with blood purity had been a farce. The blood was already tainted, already corrupted, not by a stranger, but by itself. The Thorne line was eating itself alive. Beatrice gathered the letters and the portrait. Her shock crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard fury. She walked, not ran, from the study. She found Elias in the dining room taking his solitary supper. He was reading a book of philosophy, a glass of claret at his elbow. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Mother, I am eating." Beatrice said nothing. She walked to the table and dropped the miniature portrait of Adeline in front of him. "Do you know this woman?" Elias picked it up, curious. "Number should I? She's striking." He looked closer. "She looks familiar." "Of course she does," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "Now look at this." She threw the bundle of letters onto his plate, spattering wine onto the white tablecloth, a stain like blood. Cinematic cue, the sound of the wine glass tipping, shattering on the floor. "Read them. Read what your father left behind." Elias, his annoyance turning to confusion, picked up the first letter. He read Adeline's words. He read about the affair, the business trips, the love. He read the name Alara. He read the description of the child. "Your living image, your eyes, your chin." He read the plea for protection. And he read the final letter, the one describing the wooden songbird locket. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had seen the locket. He had tried to take it from Alara once, curious, and she had fought him for it, the only time she had ever shown him violence. He looked at his mother. Her face was a gray, terrifying mask. "It's a lie," he whispered. "His bastard, it's just his bastard." "She is not just his bastard, you fool." Beatrice's voice rose to a shrill cry. "She is his daughter. She is your sister." The words hung in the air, your sister. Elias stared at his mother, his mind refusing to process the information. "That's impossible." "Go and see," Beatrice hissed. Go look at her, look at the locket your father carved. Elias stood, knocking his chair over. He ran from the dining room up the stairs to the attic. He burst into Alara's room. She was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face pale in the moonlight. The wooden songbird was on the nightstand beside her. He snatched it. He fumbled with the clasp, twisting the tail as he had seen her do. It opened. Inside was the lock of auburn hair and the tiny, silver T. The Thorne family sigil. It was true. He stumbled back, dropping the locket, which rolled onto the floor. He looked at the sleeping woman in the bed. He saw her not as his property, not as his concubine, but as a distorted reflection of himself. He saw his father's eyes, his father's chin, his father's blood, sleeping in the attic room of a slave. And then the final, devastating realization. He looked at her stomach, the gentle, unmistakable curve of the life he had forced inside her. The child, his son, and his nephew. The product of his own blood, his own family, consuming itself. The horror was not moral, it was primal. It was narcissistic. It was the ultimate, unspeakable violation of his own lineage. He backed out of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hand over his mouth. Elias Thorne did not scream. He did not rage. He returned to the dining room where his mother sat, rigid, staring at the blood-red wine stain on the tablecloth. Elias walked to the fireplace. He looked at his mother, his eyes empty. "You will never speak of this again to anyone, ever." Beatrice nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He then took the letters, the miniature portrait and the ledger, and he fed them, one by one, into the fire. Cinematic cue, the sharp crackle and hiss of the fire consuming the paper and ivory. He watched as Adeline's face blistered, browned, and turned to ash. He watched his father's handwriting, his father's sins, dissolve into smoke. He was erasing the proof, just as the law had always intended. But he could not erase the knowledge. He could not erase the child. The next morning, Alara was moved. She was not sold. To sell her would be to risk the secret ever coming out. She was not freed. That was an impossibility. She was instead erased. Elias had her moved to a remote one-room cabin on the far side of the island, deep in the cypress swamp, miles from the main house. It was a cabin that had been used decades ago, abandoned, and was now barely habitable. She was told she was being sequestered for her health to protect her from the fever. But it was a lie. She was being buried alive. Mamie was the only one allowed to bring her food once a day, a silent, grim delivery. Elias never saw her again. He could not bear to look at her. He could not bear to see his father's face, his own sin, and his sister's suffering, all in one person. Beatrice Thorne retreated into her own mind. She locked herself in her rooms, her piety curdling into a quiet madness. She would spend her days packing, polishing the family silver, her lips moving in a silent, constant prayer. She saw the stain of Augustus everywhere, in every shadow, in every reflection. The house she had fought to keep pure was now, to her, a monument to its own corruption. She and Elias rarely spoke. They would pass each other in the great hall like two ghosts, bound by a shared, unspeakable secret, the silence between them heavier and more suffocating than the marsh air outside. The great house of Cypress Hollow, once a symbol of their power, had become their shared tomb, a place where the living were haunted by the crimes of the present. In the dead of winter, alone in the swamp cabin, Alara gave birth. Mamie was there to assist, a grim, silent midwife. The child was a boy. He was born healthy, pale-skinned, and with a shock of dark auburn hair, and he had the Thorne eyes, the unmistakable hazel-gray eyes of Augustus, of Elias, and of Alara. Mamie wrapped the baby in a coarse blanket and looked at Alara, her own eyes full of a terrible, profound pity. Alara, weak and broken, did not ask for the child. She turned her face to the wall. The child was a living, breathing testament to the abomination. He was the master's son and the master's nephew. He was a slave, and he was the heir to the family's blood. He was a paradox that could not be allowed to exist. The child was not killed. Elias, in his final, twisted act of enlightenment, would not permit it, but he was not acknowledged. He was given the name August, a final, cruel irony. He was taken from Alara and given to another enslaved woman in the field quarters to be raised, just another outside child, his true lineage known only to 3 people, Alara was left in the cabin. She did not die, but she did not live. She became a permanent resident of the swamp, a crazy woman the other slaves avoided, a phantom who would sometimes be seen standing at the edge of the marsh, clutching a small, worn piece of wood. Elias Thorne continued to run Cypress Hollow, growing colder, more ruthless and more isolated, his father's true heir in every way. He never married. He never had another child. The secret was kept. It was buried in the Pluff mud, swallowed by the cypress swamp and silenced by the absolute power of the master. Young August grew up in the fields, a slave on the plantation his grandfather had built and his father-uncle owned. He was just another piece of property, his double dose of Thorne blood unrecognized, or perhaps deliberately ignored. History does not record what became of him or of Alara. When the Union Army arrived in 1865, Cypress Hollow was burned to the ground. The records, the ledgers, the whole infrastructure of the Thorne dynasty went up in flames just as the letters had. But the fire could not cleanse the soil. The law Partus Sequitur Ventrum had been designed to erase paternity, to make such horrors legally invisible. But the blood remembers. The blood always remembers, even when the archives are silent. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and keep the past from being erased.